thank you, Donald. Let me put up my slide. Yeah, okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. So my presentation will be focused more on the policy angle, because we are basically a surveillance organization, and this is actually taken from the chapter 2 or thematic chapter of our flagship report, which we produce once a year. The first part of the flagship report normally deals with a short-term outlook, and the second part deals with structural challenges to the region, and especially the long-term growth prospect. So we've been actually concerned about the growth strategy of the region over the last last 20, 30 years, and we have basically characterized the let me move on to this one. Yeah, characterize the growth strategy as manufacturing for exports. This is basically involve inviting FDI to come to the country and produce cheaper manufacturing goods for export back to the advanced economy, right? And that strategy has worked relatively well for the region over the past 5 decades. It has allowed the region to industrialize and got richer. But more recently, there's been some concern about protectionism and also the impact of technology on this strategy. So we decided in this latest report to take a closer look at these two global trends and see how it affects the growth strategy and how the strategy has evolved over time. So let me, okay. So as I mentioned, we are worried about the protectionism and the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, but technology more broadly on the growth strategy. And of course, we are coming out from the COVID-19 pandemic. So, looking ahead in the short term is going to be very bumpy, but they're also concerned about how it affects the longer term prospect of the region, whether it's going to reduce the potential growth. And so let me move on to this one here. This is a graphic representation of the growth strategy of the region. It's in a flying geese model. It's basically a simple model based on the Hedge-Lean, leveraging on a competitive advantage. So in the case of the region, most of them started off as poor developing countries. They leverage on the labor costs, cheap labor, and they industrialize, and over time they move up the value chain. So the first group of countries to follow this was the so-called NIE. Japan, of course, being the first one coming out of the war in the 50s. And then the group of NIE countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea. And that was in the 70s and 80s, followed by the ASEAN Tigers, Asian ASEAN Tigers, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia in the 80s and 90s. And then China, and finally we have the group of CLMV countries that started in the 90s and 2000, and over time they have grown, industrialized and move up the value chain. So this chart here shows the structural change in the economy over time. This is the group of CLMV countries, middle income countries, and advanced economy. So you can see that the red bar are the agriculture sector. So over time, the agriculture sector is reduced within the country, right, as they industrialize, but also over time, across time as they become middle income and advanced economy. So you can see that for the advanced economy, the agriculture sector is really small, and most of the value added is coming from manufacturing and services sector. Similarly, on the labor market, you can see the structural changes. The labor employed in agriculture decline over time, and this is part of the reason why the increase in productivity is a structural shift from agriculture into manufacturing and services sector. And so it shows a similar trend over time. And in the more advanced economy, you see that the share of agriculture, employment of labor in agriculture is really, really small. But this strategy has come under some scrutiny recently because over time, as I said, technology has made, and there's concern that technology has become made the manufacturing sector highly automated and more and more capital intensive and less labor intensive, and is a traditional role in terms of generating employment is becoming less and less effective. But I think what most people don't miss out is that the technology is also an enabler of services. And what has happened is that the technology has led to the fragmentation of the production process. And as a result, services has actually emerged as an industry on their own. So if you look at this automotive value chain, right, a lot of the, the input is in terms of services, from pre-production stage to the factory stage to the post-factory delivery and then finally. So over time, the manufacturing part of the value chain has become smaller and smaller. And this is what I think Edwin pointed out earlier, that China, for instance, contributes only 4% of the value add of the total export of China to the Apple. Uh, Whereas much of the value add is now coming from services. And services, as you know, is relatively labor intensive, and that's where the generation of employment takes place. So in the case of Thailand automotive sector, you can see that its export of services has become quite important, and it's a regional hub for export of automotive value, services to the region. Similarly for China, this is export of China services. Back in 2000, it was a small dot here, but in 2018, it has emerged to become a relatively large services hub, and it has actually grown faster than manufacturing over time. Um, so services has emerged as another driver of growth for and you know and value in that region. Uh, so our view was that it's not just manufacturing. You got to augment the strategy now with services. Another concern that I just highlighted is the protectionism. There's been a view that the world is deglobalizing, and this is a very I think commonly cited chart that global trade has stagnated as a percent of GDP. And if you look at some of the indicators, indeed they have come down. International migrant stock, world trade, capital flows, and the only one that has increased is harmful trade intervention, right? So there is some validity to the you know view that perhaps there's a rise of protectionism, anti-globalization over time. And of course, this has been, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic because of the disruption to the supply chain. And, so the protectionist sentiment has become even stronger. Uh, and there's a view that perhaps the country should now onshore the production rather than, depend on the global value chain, which is quite vulnerable to disruption. So we decided to take a look at the share of contribution of external demand to growth, GDP over time. This is a chart of the contribution of demand or expenditure to growth from 2006 to 2018. If you remember, we have the Great Recession or the global financial crisis back in 2009. And the share of external demand or contribution is in the gray bar, and it turned negative in 2009 for the region as a whole, the ASEAN plus 4, China and Vietnam. And following that year, there was a rebalancing of growth, where basically countries pump up domestic demand in order to support the economy. So as a result, in 2010, the contribution external demand improved, but over time it has declined. So progressively, the contribution external demand has actually gone down. Uh, and you can see that more clearly here, where the share of external demand to, in terms of GDP growth has gone from 27% to 19%, so an 8 percentage point decline, which is very big. So the export, manufacturing for export, the export side of it has indeed become less effective, and there's been a rebalancing of growth towards domestic demand. This chart shows the consumption of manufacturing export by the region, the red bar, and you can see the consumption has increased over time, and the share of export has declined, right? Or external demand. And if you look at this is this bar here, the blue bar, but divided into destination. The share of intra-regional demand has actually increased from 35% to 40%. So domestic demand and intra-regional demand is now becoming a major driver of growth for the region. And the reason for that is simple. The region has industrialized, over time, and it's gone richer. This is a chart showing the per capita income of the region, and as you can see, many of them started poor and now has become relatively rich. These are for the high-income economy, income ranging between 30,000 and 60,000. For the middle income, between 4,000 to 10,000, and then even for the CLMV countries, they have basically moved from poor to low middle income economies. So going forward, the region has become a major consumer market for the product for its own product. This is a chart by McKinsey projecting increased share of urban consumption over the next 10 years. And you can see the ASEAN+3 will account for 42% of the growth compared to the other region, even the US and Canada. And in terms of luxury product, we all know that China is number one. It's going to be the biggest market for luxury products in the world. And tourism is interesting because tourism is a sector which is basically for the affluent, the middle class, right? And you can see that this is the contribution of ASEAN+3 to tourist arrival, and it is the the one that is really propelling the tourism industry in the region. So now you have a confluence of two forces. One is the rise of the emergence of the affluent middle class, and it's still growing rapidly, right? And that is become a major driver for growth, and so that reduced dependence on the more advanced economy for demand. So this chart shows the impact of technology on the economy. Because of the pandemic, of course, they accelerated the process of e-commerce, and logistics is a very important part of the e-commerce sector. And it turns out logistics is relatively manual at the moment, and still has a lot of scope for automation and leveraging on the IoT, Internet of Things, and other technology. So this basically sums up the shift in the growth paradigm from traditional to the more modern. Traditionally, I guess the manufacturing exports have captured the growth model pretty well. They basically produce low manufacturing goods for export to advanced economies, especially the US and Europe. Going forward, they're more dependent on regional demand and domestic demand. And also in terms of the goods that's been produced, it's now much more dependent because of the new technology. It's much more customized, experiential type of products. So it's a more innovation, and so the dependence is much more on the competitive advantage, where you need to build a certain niche in the industry and use that to drive your growth. And in a traditional growth model, you start from low labor intensive product and you move up the ladder. In the new model, you can fit into the value chain from anywhere. So for instance, a good example would be all the apps that you find on the on the Androids, right? If you are smart, you can come up with some game, or you come up with some kind of application that is useful, and immediately you leap into the value chain. So let me sum up. So going forward, the environment is very challenging because of COVID-19, and everybody is talking about new normal and how, and it could be some, it's going to be much different from the old normal. And the challenge is whether the countries in the region will be able to transition from the traditional to the new. The other challenge is protectionism. The trade war between China and the US is doesn't seem to be subsiding. If anything, it's getting worse. And disruptive technology. Technology is an enabler, but it's also very disruptive for the traditional industry. So e-commerce, for instance, has disrupted the traditional shopping. And the GVC will definitely be configured because of these forces, protectionism. There'll be more onshoring, reshoring, and at the same time, digital technology will affect the global value chain. So, e-commerce is a very good example. Ride sharing is another example, right? But our view is that the region as a whole will do well because they've become highly competitive as a region because of the highly integrated regional supply chain, and also on the income side, a rapidly growing middle class, right? So despite the protectionism, the region has sufficient uh, momentum to be able to grow on its own. But at the same time, I think the region, even while it becomes more integrated, is committed to be plugged into the rules-based multilateral trade system, and can take advantage of the broader global economy in order to grow the economy themselves. Um, so let me stop here. Be happy to take questions later.